Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Meyers Report Roundtable. It is Wednesday, the 20th of November, and this is a recap of the election and what we can expect to come. It's been quite a period. The election has provided what I believe is a tectonic shift in American politics because the people have spoken boldly, loudly, clearly. They are tired of government lies. They are tired of the media lies. They want safety, they want truth, and they want a path to prosperity through hard work. They don't want special help, and they don't want special advantages. And they are angry. Yes, they are really angry at people who are getting special advantages. This is a meritocracy. That's what we are built on. That's what everybody wants. This anger is going to be soon directed toward the vaccine lies, which were very clearly there, and profiteering and climate lies that are not far behind the vaccine lies. What people want could not be clearer. What they want is truth, justice, and the American way. And those of us who are old enough to remember that phrase, there's a real validity to it because it described a whole milieu of what the country is supposed to be about. Because even if we're not perfect, we still have to have goals. And the goals are to try and be perfect or to make things better. And what everyone really wants is a fair shake. Now, the question is, have the Democrats learned anything by what's going on? It does not appear so. Consider Senator-elect Alyssa Slotkin, Democrat from Michigan. She said that we should get rid of identity politics. But the reason she gave was that we should get rid of the Democrats should get rid of identity politics so they could win over voters. Well, the point is, she missed the major point. You don't get rid of a policy to win over voters. You get rid of a policy because it's wrong and you need to do the right thing. That's where the Democrats lost. They missed that identity politics is simply wrong. And until they understand that doing the right thing is the way to attract voters and treating voters like they're intelligent people as opposed to morons, irredeemables, or garbage, this is the wrong thing. So this is what the Democrats and the old institutional rhinos are missing. That all being said, the American people want the truth, and it seems that President Trump and the Trump Republicans understand this. This is representative of a whole new era in the U.S., one based on old-fashioned values. They may not be perfect, but they're values to at least try to reach. The United States, in my belief, is about to move into a new period of greatness, like the Reagan era, but even better, providing, I think we can do it better this time, providing we can avoid World War III because of the stupidity that's going on. But I don't think that's going to happen, but let's get to the point. Let's get rid of that one very clearly. Paul McGonigal is a former diplomat. He was with the Reagan, the Ford, the Carter, and Nixon administrations, and he was an international banker on the highest levels throughout the world. Paul, why are we going to do you think we're going to have World War III?
Well, first of all, let me define what we might think World War III is. World War III is a nuclear exchange. My view is that that won't happen because nobody has an interest, Russians, Americans, Chinese, anybody, in mutual annihilation, because that would be the outcome of World War III. Now, it has been argued that we walked into World War I, and we could also walk into this. But in World War I, we had no idea of what the consequences, or they had no idea of what the consequences of that would be. We have a pretty clear idea from 1945 what the consequences of World War III would be. And so very clearly there's no winner. And so since you can't win, there's no incentive to get anywhere near it. And escalation at the margin in Ukraine isn't going to do it. You know, you could escalate your way all the way up, but it's very unlikely. I mean, They're not going to sacrifice Washington, well, Moscow. We're not going to sacrifice. They're not going to sacrifice Beijing and a few other big cities. We're not going to sacrifice Washington, although some would like to. So it's just not going to happen.
It seems to me that one point that's often missed is that no matter what you think about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it made it very clear what the devastation could be.
Yeah, and
I
those
think
things that
that kept us from a
and what
nuclear
was
holocaust.
dropped in those cases was peanuts compared to what would be dropped now.
But I think people know that.
I know.
Okay, so
We
you don't.
got a good look at it.
I think so. So in that regard, I would be optimistic that we will dodge that bullet.
I am too.
Okay,
Paul?
Bob Janetsky, moving on.
Paul, who would have thought we would have pulled out of Afghanistan?
Everybody. Trump signed a deal to get out of Afghanistan in early 2000, 20, was it? Yeah. He signed a deal to get out. We were on the way out. Obama was on the way out. And so all Biden did was with extreme, it was the catastrophe about the way we pulled out, which had two things behind it. One was Biden's extreme anger at having been overridden multiple times in the Obama administration when he was advocating exit and Obama wouldn't leave. He was pissed and he got rolled multiple times by the military getting to Obama like either more effectively or before he did. So he was pissed.
How do you factor in the recent missile sale that Ukraine is using and the now change of policy on anti-personnel mines being deployed by our administration?
My view of that is that how come it's okay for Russia to bomb Kiev, and it's not okay for the Ukrainians to up the ante a little bit on their side?
Seems to be what's good for the goose might be good for the gander in the leveling the playing field. It seems to me that we are on the downside, not the upside of the idea of.
I think we're one step behind in terms of escalation all the time.
Okay, I agree with you. Thank
And
you.
if you don't do something like we did, you hand the escalatory decisions to Russia and you give them all the leverage.
Okay, that being said, I think that irrespective, as Barack Obama very succinctly put it, never underestimate how badly Joe Biden can fuck things up.
Yeah, and Obama also said, let's not do stupid shit. So I hope this isn't stupid shit.
My point is, I think that the world leaders have already signaled that they're ready for a new administration and to get the wars settled. Does that make sense?
Barack who?
But this guy that ran the country for about 8 years.
Okay, moving on. The economy, Bob Janetsky, our chief economist. Where do you see the country's economy going under a Trump administration?
Oh, we are on the verge of monumental policy changes. And these changes
Are they good policy changes?
They're good policy changes. They're going to usher in a whole new era. And I'm going to give some perspective to just what's happening here. Since 1900, our economy has had 7 bad cycles where we moved away from free market classical principles. We suffered the consequences. The most recent cycle began with the outbreak of COVID and the government taking over with all the government spending and all these new programs. And then Biden just introduced brand new programs on top of that. And it seemed like government spending, control over the economy was simply going to grow inevitably after each cycle, and there would not be any changes. And a matter of fact, 4 or 5 years ago, when I saw all this happening, I said we are in for a period of flat to down living standards. That was my forecast. And I'm happy to say that, not happy to say, I wish it didn't happen, but that forecast came to pass. And we ended up with a decline in living standards over the course of the past several years. The public recognized that. And now, with Trump's overwhelming victory, it means we're about to shift gears. And we're going to have some major changes. We're not talking about the sort of changes that Trump had during his first period. Those were very good changes, I believe, from an economic standpoint, but they were kind of moving around the edges. They weren't substantial. What we're going to see is a fundamental changing of the nature of our government. His overwhelming victory is going to allow for a major extension of policies. And I would like to talk about the two, what I consider to be the two major policy changes that are going to bring about this whole big era of change. The first is the Government Efficiency Council. Now, I've done a lot of research on government all my career, and my conclusion time and again is that the private sector is twice as efficient as the government sector. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the government sector, which right now controls about $10 trillion a year, if you count spending and regulations, is wasting about $5 trillion a year because they're half as efficient as the private sector. So what do you do about this? Well, in the past, it's been tinkering around the edges. What Trump has done in creating a Government Efficiency Council, and more important, of putting two people like Elon and Vivek in charge of it, is he has paved the way for some very significant major changes in government. And when I look at the potential for maybe saving, would there potentially be $5 trillion of waste? I think Musk is right on target. He should easily be able to cut $2 trillion of that rate. So that's the first major change. Second major change coming is the result of what's happening at Health and Human Services and putting RFK Jr. in charge of that. You have to start and realize that our healthcare system is the most wasteful healthcare system on the planet Earth. We spend $5 trillion or more a year on healthcare. But if you compare it with more efficient systems, we are wasting again. Half of that money is pure waste. So what's needed? What's needed is a basic restructuring of the impact that the government has on the economy through the healthcare system. And I've followed RFK Jr. I've read much of his stuff and the stuff that he's supporting. And I believe we are not only going to see a healthier population, which in and of itself is going to cut the costs, healthcare costs in the economy, but we are also going to see major structural changes toward providing us with a more efficient system than we ever had. The situation that we faced with today happens to be the best opportunity I have ever seen in my entire career to make major changes in this seemingly relentless growth in government power, government control over the economy. We've got like one big shot at it. And I'm convinced that with the people who I've seen involved, that they are going to end up winning. And we are going to see not just tinkering at the edges, but we're going to see a major new era of prosperity. And I have a couple of charts, just two of them I want to close with. If you can see the wages of annual wages, and it's from 2015 to the current period, and then projecting out over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. Basically, what happened was during the first Trump administration, wages increased. The average salary of all workers, as well as non-supervisory workers, tended to trend upward. We had a huge spike in 2020, but that was not because wages just all of a sudden exploded upward. It was that the labor force shrank tremendously as a lot of lower income workers simply couldn't work. And so we had an artificial spike. That ended by about the beginning of 2022. And since then, living standards have been flat to down by this particular measure. There's another, and what I believe is going to happen in the future is we are going to see, not immediately, but I would think it's going to start by the end of next year. We're going to start to see those real wages increase and increase progressively more as we get out into 26 and 27. The same thing is likely to occur in terms of consumer sentiment. Consumer sentiment, if you're familiar with the figures, just was extremely high in the vicinity of 90 to 100 during the first Trump period. It has since dropped down about 30% from where it was, and it remains depressed. That's another reason that Harris lost the election and Trump won it. My projection of where consumer sentiment is going is that it's going to reverse itself, and by the end of the next 4 years, we'll be right back up in the 90s to 100s, which is where we were before. So we're not talking about minor changes, we're talking about major changes. We had one example in history where we had such major changes, and that was about 100 years ago in the 1920s under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. During that period, federal spending was cut in half. Major acts taken to federal spending. And what happened? We ended up with the most prosperous period in our history, the most prosperous 10 years, something known as the Roaring Twenties, which only ended with the beginning of bad economic policies that began in 1929.
Things are looking very good. I agree with you. And we'll go on from there. In the meantime, election integrity. We made incredible progress since the 2020 election. And we have with us Jim Womack, who is a graduate of West Point. He knows obviously the military very well. I think he retired as either lieutenant colonel or a colonel. And he is an expert he's one of the leaders of election integrity in the country. Jim, faith in our electoral system is critical for the peace and tranquility of our nation and for us to prosper as an economy. What gains have we made since the presidential and the last midterm elections?
Well, thank you, Gary. It's good to be with you today. I'm going to share a screen and go through a couple of quick slides so we can see where we were and where we're headed. Back in 2022, on the eve of the 2022 midterm election, there had been a massive revisiting, if you will, of citizens about the outcomes of the 2020 election. There were people that were very concerned about the incongruity with the election results and what intuition would tell you about the election. There was a lot of surprise and shock around the country. The state of Virginia kind of set the pace, though, for us, because coming out of that election, they had a gubernatorial election the next year, and then they did some pretty mystical things, which made a huge difference in their outcome, where they elected a Republican governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. And coming out of that election, they did some things where they got citizen activism and they got behind election integrity in a big way through mostly small scale, low level activity. And by the fall of 2022 or summer fall of 2022, awareness had been raised to the point that the number one issue among red-blooded Americans, particularly the CPAC crowd, was election integrity. It had risen to the top of the list, above the border wall and immigration, energy independence, constitutional rights, inflation, et cetera, all the way down. This was the number one issue facing America going into the midterm election. So having embraced the public's awareness and concerns about the problems of the nefarious activity and the documentaries people were now starting to see about the 2020 election, there were several things that were done. The most important thing was Cleta Mitchell's initiative to create an election integrity network, EIN, nationally. It's a national effort. It's got stakeholders all the way from Congress to the court system to state level coordinators like myself all across the country. And she mobilized around the Virginia model all the activities that needed to go on. In North Carolina, we call it the 8 lanes of election integrity, where you focus on not just the voter list or not just the election tabulations or the machines, you focus on the full enterprise of election integrity. There were several things that were accomplishments in the 2024 election that came directly out of Cleta Mitchell's initiative and the national awareness of what needs to go on. One, Trump was reelected because we were able to shut down a lot of the nefarious activity that was going on nationwide, particularly with in-person voting. We now have poll observers and judges and poll workers all over the country who are shutting down closing off loopholes and shutting down illicit behavior. The benefits that we get from Trump's reelection.
By the way, they were all volunteers, weren't they,
They
Jay?
weren't. Almost all volunteers. There were very little that was coordinated and funded, though there were 501 groups like my group, Insight, and others around the country that got small amounts of low-level donations, $25 and $50 at a time, to help us with some of the training materials and the travel. But essentially, none of us are compensated. We all were working for peanuts just so we could secure the election. And Trump's reelection brought about several benefits. One, it exposed now we can expose the deep state corruption and prosecutions that were going on. We think prosecutions will follow as more of this exposure occurs, and you can document it. Hopefully, some of these people that have been operating illegally behind the scenes will be exposed and prosecuted. There's now federal awareness, and we now have the Congress attuned to what needs to happen in correcting decades of inappropriate legislation in both the National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter, the HAVA Act in the early 2000s, FSMA, and other things which were shaped around left-wing issues and allowing the maximum number of people to vote, whether they were legal or not, and getting involved in our elections. So this awareness that we have on the federal level is stimulating new legislation coming out of the Congress, which should get passed this year. The Election Integrity Network is a great benefactor of the awareness, and now we have all this great talent from all across the country: legal talent, data analysts, and systems engineers. We have low-level grassroots volunteers, and these people also bring influence because they're propagating all over the country. There's literally tens of thousands of volunteers now getting involved in elections and now putting heat on their local legislatures to get involved and to pass laws that close loopholes. And that citizen awareness is really important. That volunteerism you can't replace. You can't pay. Good money can't buy the kinds of patriotic volunteering that we have around the country. So that legislative advocacy and pressure that these citizens are providing really helps propel this effort going forward. Now, that's not all good news, okay? We have still major challenges facing the election integrity movement. One, every one of the 50 states has a corrupt voter list, and some states are much worse than others. My state, North Carolina, is about average with, 14 to 15% of the state voter registration list is absolutely invalid. These are ballots that can be harvested by the left to steal an election. We just saw this just happen in North Carolina, where we lost a Supreme Court race and 3 critical legislative races because of illicit voting, illegal voting coming from overseas.
You were talking about UOCAVA voters.
Yeah, going to get into UOCAVA in a minute, but corrupt voter lists create the environment for voter fraud, because without a corrupt voter list, it's very hard to cheat. If you have a corrupt voter list, then you can harvest ballots, millions of ballots around the country. And that's what happened in 2020, we believe, in absentee by mail. So corrupt voter lists have got to be corrected. The remedy for that is corrections or changes in NVRA and the HAVA. The lack of election auditability. No one in the country does an audit on their elections. Nowhere. They call them risk limiting audits, but they don't limit risk, and they certainly are not audits. Not in the conventional standards like you would think of a financial audit. And so now states are starting to wake up about needing to do audits. And I think the Election Assistance Commission at the federal level is wanting to get involved in best practices for audits. CLETA has a national working group on audits, which I think is going to make some real progress in the coming year in putting standards out there for the EAC to promulgate. UOCAVA is a real problem. That's the Uniformed and Overseas Civilian Absentee Voting Act, which basically was created for the military that's deployed abroad, but it's been now being abused by foreign living citizens that have not been in the country for decades that are now being harvested and voting in this election. We saw in North Carolina in 2024, we saw, tens of thousands of these voters, many of whom had never voted before, coming in and weighing in on this election. And by the way, in the state of North Carolina, those ballots could be received 10 days after November the 5th. Up to 10 days after the election, it could be received, and they had an impact on the outcomes of several of our races. So this is something that's a loophole that's got to be closed, and state and federal agencies need to tighten up on the UOCAVA permissions. Lack of federal standards for voter registration and election management is a real problem. We have We have no, unlike all these other federal bureaus and agencies that operate like the SACWIS system for child welfare, the Child Support Enforcement System nationally, the WIC system. All these federal agencies have standards documents and requirements that have to be adhered to get grant funding from the federal government. And the states are meticulous in conforming to those standards. In elections, none of that exists. There's nowhere in the country a standards document for conducting an election or for managing a voter registration list. There's a few articles in the statutes under Title 52, but there's no standards documents. So when you have no standards, guess what you end up with? You end up with corrupt practices down at the state level, and it varies from state to state, sometimes within jurisdictions within the state. So those standards documents really need to be done. We're working now with EAC and others to try to and with the Congress to try to put forth a requirement for EAC to promulgate standards that will have to be adhered to by the states in order to receive federal funding for any aspect of the elections. And then the last thing on here is abuse of voting by mail. Still the weakest link in our elections around the country are voting by mail. They are, people like to say that the United States Postal Service is the largest unsupervised precinct in the country. And that's true. Millions of ballots flow through the U.S. Postal Service, some of which leave the state, go to another state, and then come back in order to be delivered and counted. It's a real
to go back to 2005 Carter-Baker Commission.
Yep.
With Jimmy Carter, they identified voting by mail as being the number 1 threat to our election system.
It is, and guess what? There are 4 states that's the primary means of how people vote. Go figure, all 4 of them are blue states. And they're trying to propel that around the country. We are trying to promulgate a pattern of behavior that says everyone should have the opportunity in the country for in-person paper ballot, hand-marked, that's read by a machine and counted that way with an auditable machine. That's the way we got to run future elections. Without hand-marked paper ballots and without an in-person voting capability, I think we're always going to have suspected fraud in our elections. But these are things that still await us. We're working now aggressively, and I think with the new Trump administration and the measures we hear are coming forward, we're very optimistic that a lot of this will get put in place over the next 2 years.
Who are some of the unsung heroes that we're going to be hearing about soon for election integrity?
Okay, so first off, one of them's on the call, Barry Chapman, who's a systems engineer and expert on process engineering. This guy is really good. A talent like him. Marcel Sturbich in Ohio, who's a cybersecurity expert, is really good. There are a number of accomplished lawyers who have been around for many years, like Hans von Spakovsky at Heritage and J. Christian Adams at PILF. Ken Cuccinelli, who runs the Election Transparency Initiative. He's got a listserv that's very much like the Drudge Report for elections. I highly encourage people to be a subscriber to that to stay abreast of what goes on. Cleta Mitchell I tell people Cleta is like is to us what Mother Teresa was to the Catholic Church. She is the one honest broker, the one person everyone reveres and should look up to because of her leadership in this space. But there are
her courage.
Oh, yeah. To be demonized the way she is in the media and to continue to press on and to do all the things that she does. It's just amazing the talent that she brings to the table and the connection she has. I'll tell you another one. Molly Hemingway and the Federalist, their coverage of election developments. If you don't subscribe to the Federalist, shame on you. I'm telling you, she's got a team of journalists that are tracking and managing and reporting, unbiased reporting on every aspect of these elections. And without them, we would not be making the progress that we are.
Okay, moving on. Hal Daub, a former congressman from Nebraska and 2-time mayor of Omaha, an attorney, and who is currently chairman of a 4-state hospital system. Hal knows government from the local, state, and federal level. Hal, how do you see the country has demanded a change of course? Can you identify what you have seen as a result of this election?
Thank you, Gary, and hello, everybody. It's good to be with you all tonight. I'm pleased to share my views with all of you, and I've enjoyed Paul and Bob and Jim's input to our forum tonight. Well, welcome to the sea change. And boy, has it been a sea change. this president's inner circle decided 6 months ago that in the event they could engineer a victory, they would be prepared to do many new things. One of which was to put together a team to vet people for high-profile Senate-confirmed cabinet-level positions. And as you've seen, they have announced 14 cabinet-level nomination individuals in 14 days. They have broke every mold you could ever thought about 2 weeks or 2 months ago in terms of catching the deep state off guard, totally off guard, in how to use the Thanksgiving to Christmas to New Year's holiday to prepare their loyal opposition. So from a strategic or tactical point of view, you got to call it brilliant. That's the only word I can use. It's creative and it's brilliant. What you see as a thread in every one of the nominations is a commitment not just to this attack on loyalty or litmus test ideology. It is a systematic, thoughtful appointment process. Every one of them so far, every one of them, in my view, understands this president's one term, not two, he's term limited, he only gets 4 years, commitment to really changing the deep state's look at how Americans benefit from their federal central system. So I'm very pleased about this breaking of the mold. It's probably quite a surprise, in my view, even to conservatives, maybe even to some of us on this call tonight. So philosophically, I don't see one appointment that isn't in the mold. The Senate will be very hard-pressed to defeat any of them, including the nomination for Attorney General, in my view. I think that the tenets are simple. The first tenet is less government, which means less regulation activity. The second is a foreign policy that is resolute with respect to, are you with us or you are not with us? I didn't use the word, are you against us? Please listen to what I said. I said, are you with us or not with us? And that will be the litmus test for this administration. And I'd like to say to you that we will have a president for the next 4 years who will be making decisions, not asleep on the beach. He will be very much involved in the process of pursuing the philosophical idea of less government and a government that's lower cost. Now, I want to touch on a couple things quickly, real quickly. Is the new meme, is it Doge or Dodge, or how do we call the Vivek?
Doge.
Everybody says it's Elon Vivek, but I'd like to tell you it's Vivek Elon. Please don't underestimate Vivek Ramaswamy's impact on the thinking. Not that Trump wasn't already there, but he's found a couple of people and he's made a decision that I think is important to watch, and it's a nuance that I think we will all watch the next 6 months. He understands that there's no federal bureaucracy that can make decisions that support those recommendations as they come. But he's saying, one step at a time, let's take 2 years and let's get a list and let's vet those lists to see what progress we can make. I think it's brilliant because the marketing that will go behind the politics of getting those changes made is not going to be a shock to the American people, because these will be the specifics that implement what will be the question to America. Did you vote for this guy this is what he'd like to do. And to the Senate, which will be the biggest problem, not the House. The House, even with its slim majority, isn't going to be the problem. It's going to be the Senate. There are 4 or 5 senators in the Republican Party that are very difficult to read. So that's where the vice president, who you haven't heard much from the last 2 weeks, is going to play an important role. You've started to see him surface in his advocacy for the Getz nomination for Attorney General. Very important. It looks like that's the role he's going to be asked to play in his relationship with the Senate, which I think will pay immense dividends. So my view is that philosophy is going to govern here. This president has made up his mind that he's going, I don't want to use the term balls to the wall. I think he's smarter than that. And his 3 or 4 months of work to be prepared for winning should be amazing to everybody. That's just such, it breaks the mold. And the liberals and the deep state at this point don't appear to have any ability to organize much of an opposition. So time will tell. I think very good times are ahead from a public policy point of view from this new administration. And I think the Senate, by and large, will ultimately confirm his appointments, all of them at this point in time. I don't see one of them losing.
Thanks, Hal. Moving on to international relations, Paul McGonigal, as we said, is a former diplomat and international banker on the highest levels. Paul has been a never Trumper. Paul, as a never Trumper, how do you view the foreign policy prospects of a new Trump administration?
If this administration comes into office, it faces a number of situations internationally which have extreme explosive potential and are unsustainable in current circumstances. And that makes, and I think that under current policies, obtaining our objectives in any of the areas that I'll mention that are explosive and unsustainable are highly unlikely unless we have a sea change internationally in terms of our approach to these problems. The first, of course, is the Ukraine. And the objective is to get a mutually acceptable agreement between the two parties out there, or at least a mutually unacceptable agreement. Because in any successful negotiation, nobody ever gets everything they want. So the definition of a successful negotiation is not somebody getting everything they want. That can only be done by force, not by negotiation.
I agree.
Then there's the Middle East. And the objective there is to get a solution which combines recognizing the legitimate political and other economic and other aspirations of the Palestinian population, while at the same time guaranteeing security for Israel. That's a tough one to square. Then, of course, there's the third objective is defanging Iran, not only in preventing their acquisition of a nuclear capability, but in mitigating or diluting their terrorist threat to the rest of the region, which we have not successfully done either. And finally, is China. And the objective there is to dissuade China from materially supporting the Russians in their attempted conquest of Ukraine, which is what's going on there, and or the forced absorption of Taiwan, which we know is ultimately, well, absorption is their objective. If it happens organically, we could live with that. If it happens non-organically, we can't, we say. So anyway, given the persistence of all these problems over the last 3 years, it's pretty clear to me the existing policy array that we have isn't doing it. We need to get out of the box. And most of the people on this call know I'm not a big fan of the Donald.
Would you classify yourself as a never Trumper?
I would classify myself not quite a never Trumper, but some of his tendencies bother me a lot. And they have to do with recognizing constraints on his activity. You can't run the country like it's a family business.
Okay, be that
And,
as it may, we've established you're not a pro Donald Trump guy.
yeah.
You think we can expect
But I
a
think we need
positive
some
outcome?
out of the box thinking, and I don't think there are very many people that are more capable of Donald Trump than getting us out of the box. You may not like everything he's doing all the time, but I gotta say that what we're doing isn't working. We owe him a chance to take a good shot at it, and we owe him our support in his efforts.
Paul, what about the Philippines and the South Sea?
Philippines and the South Sea, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how firm Donald Trump's commitment would be to the defense of the Philippines. He waffled on the defense of Taiwan. So what
Taiwan
confidence
is a
do I
different
have?
situation than the Philippines.
Well, it's a situation, but it's a more strategically relevant one than the Philippines,
Right,
probably.
it's proximate to the Chinese border, right, right.
Yeah, and he waffled on that one. And everybody remembers when he said, "Would he defend the Philippines?" He said, "These guys cleaned out our tech industry. Why would I defend them?" So,
Interesting.
you can't, what I don't want to do is what the press does, is go and look for a nugget of what he said and explode it into a whole, policy framework. But I don't have a great deal of confidence that if things got hot in the Philippines, the United States, unlike Taiwan, where we have no commitment, no treaty commitment to defend them, we do have a treaty commitment to defend the Philippines.
So bottom
And
line,
I'm not sure that he would stand by that.
bottom line, do you think that Donald Trump will be successful in generally bringing a more peaceful environment to the areas that threaten us most?
I think he has a better chance than the policies of the government. I don't know what his policies exactly are going to look like, but I think he's got a better chance in the continuation of the policies that we have, so I'm willing to give him a shot.
What about the
And I
Abraham
think we
Accords?
evaluate it as we go along. We don't have to really forecast it here.
I agree with Paul on that. I do, yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, one other question I want to put to both Hal and to Paul McGonigal. There's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump becoming a dictator, becoming a Hitler. I think it's stupid.
Not a chance.
Well, that's the politics of the rhetoric are now behind us, and so I appreciate the question, Gary. First of all, let me say to Bob Zanetsky, I hope his day one dictatorship decisions by executive order contemplate a significant amount of deregulatory activity on the environment, on getting out of the Paris Peace Accords, the environmental deals, all that stuff. That is a signal, I would think, to the markets that he means business. His appointments so far look like they're headed in that direction. Then I would say is it James or Jim?
It's Jim.
Jim, I really appreciated your insight tonight. I learned a lot from that, and I appreciate it. I want to give credit and positive compliments to the election integrity movement, to my dear longtime friend Cleta, and all the work everyone has done. But you look at the numbers right now and all the polling, where Republicans are looking at election integrity and their view of fraud and shenanigans, and feel that the elections are like over 90% safe. Democrats are in reverse now, thinking that election integrity is like 30 or 40%. They have a problem. So beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. I want us to be careful not to overemphasize and beat our chest too much. We're making progress. There's still work to be done, but let's be very careful not to bite off our nose in spite of our face here. We've made a lot of progress on election integrity.
Yeah, but
we got to be careful not to overdo it.
there is no finite period where the election integrity effort should end. This is spy versus spy. This is going to go on forever.
Believe me, we're not complacent at all, and we're not overconfident at all. We're hungry, and we're just scratching the surface of what needs to be done to secure our elections going forward. I can tell you that what I was talking about with the movement now, we have the attention of the Congress and of many of the state legislatures that are starting to close decades of loopholes that have been created by the left. It's got 30 years of head start on us. So we've got much to do. It'll be another 5 to 7 years if with conservative support in legislatures. It'll be 5 to 7 years before all the states get on board. It's a long haul for us. This is not a tactical engagement.
I agree with it, but the focus has to be on the states because we do not want to federalize all local elections.
Yeah, and to that regard, you have to have a set of federal standards that people need to adhere to. That's the emphasis I was placing. If you don't have federal standards, then every state's inventing their own. Now, time, manner, and locations by constitutional edict are the province of the states and the state legislatures. However, they need, just like interstate commerce, they need some framework from which to establish standards and best practices. If they don't have that framework, they're all inventing their own, and you'll never have a uniform set of standards for a federal election.
If we had them, that would help eliminate this back and forth between state judiciaries and the state legislatures, right? As they bounce these things back and forth, right?
Yeah, it's incessant. It goes on in all the swing states, every election cycle. It's the same thing of the judiciary, depending upon the political predisposition of the legislature and the courts. Most of these are elected judges. They go back and forth suing till they're blue. And,
so I'm going to be a dickhead for a second here.
Paul, don't describe yourself that way.
How did the good guys here let this happen for 30 years?
Well, don't be intellectually dishonest. What about the Department of Education? You want to eliminate it or let the state and the local governments? You can't be intellectually inconsistent here. You have to be, in terms of federalism, very careful to be consistent.
I'd like to see the Department of Education go away.
You could have federal standards on the education front too, but you don't need the Department of Education.
Amen.
Paul, did I just hear Paul say that?
When Gary asked me the other day about how I felt about eliminating the Department of Education, and my response was, I don't know what they do.
Where there's the smallest federal government agency, they only have 4,000 employees. So, no big loss.
Isn't going to make much difference. I mean, but
I'll bet it's at the top of
I would rather eliminate teachers' unions than eliminate the Department of Education. I think that would help. Much more substantive impact. Well,
I've been saying for 30 years, I think the most destructive force in this country has been the teachers' unions.
Absolutely.
Shifting on for a minute. Well, one of the things we need to do is to get rid of the indoctrination in the school systems, but that's a whole nother subject.
We don't have time for that. Right?
No. Okay, I want to shift it back a little bit toward economics. One of the biggest challenges that the Donald Trump administration can face is the mortgages from commercial office buildings, which are largely empty. Vacancy rates in major areas are 30, 40, 50%. And the question is, Paul, 1 second. I'm coming to you.
Yeah.
The question is, these mortgages are going to fail. So the question is, are we looking at another banking crisis similar to 2007 and 8, or the S&L crisis that occurred during the Reagan administration as a result of Carter policies? Paul, I don't think we are. Paul, do you think?
I think, first of all, I think you need to differentiate the commercial real estate front a little bit, because the Class A buildings are having a much less, mostly this involves Class B and C buildings, not Class A buildings.
There's some pretty empty Class A buildings
as we sit here and speak.
I'm sorry, but why do you want them to go back to work?
I don't know if y'all are open to discussion on this, but I feel like I'm a subject matter expert in the warehousing. In the last 2 weeks, my warehouses.
1 second. This is, by the way, I think this is Zach Myberg, who does own some significant warehouses. What were you saying, Zach?
Yeah, we've got about 1.5 million square feet between Rockford, Illinois, and Houston, Texas. And We were running on 70, 80% kind of on both fronts. And in the last 2 weeks, we've exploded, like to the point that we now have product sitting in the aisle of our warehouses. I mean, it's to the point, and we're turning customers away, not even with the ability to quote. So it's turned. And I know there's a huge concern right now about the commercial and real estate space that's sitting open, particularly these empty
Zach,
buildings.
we're not talking about warehouse. We're talking about office buildings and the large regional shopping malls that are largely empty, not warehouses. That's a good business to be in.
Yes, but the banks are looking also at the warehouses because there was a bunch of empty warehouses built by a bunch of private equity firms that were sitting out there. And I think those are going to fill up really quick. And I think the general public is lumping the two together.
Yeah.
And they're really two separate issues.
Okay.
So I'll take my answer offline on that.
I can't get my heart to bleed for private equity firms. Sorry.
Okay, be that as it may, Paul McGonigal.
But I think, there's a differentiation on the commercial real estate, the office space front between Class A buildings and the lesser buildings of lesser quality. And the problem now is centered on those buildings of lesser quality. Secondly, the labor market is leveling off, and the negotiating position of the labor forces is weakening daily. And in company after company is mandating that these guys come back and ladies come back 5 days a week. And I think that's going to continue. So the Class A buildings are probably going to progressively fill up, and maybe faster than you think.
Paul, I agree with you, but I wonder what Bob Zdarsky thinks about that.
My guess is that most of that, I don't know, Paul, you think, Paul, you're more of the expert, but I thought more of that was already written off to a very large extent.
And most of that's been absorbed.
Yeah, and the funds that basically hold those buildings, and there are some ETFs, I mean, they already took their bath. And I think it's something that's well known and pretty much been adjusted to by now. That would be my.
Well, also the banks are much better fiscal position than they were in 2008. They have more reserves.
My question, Gary, to both Bob and Paul on this thread, in terms of the size of the federal workforce, and they mandate that you go to work or quit. Very, very simple. That's where you find this whole Trump group looking at come back to work or quit. How does that impact on vacancy, occupancy, and mortgage lending?
Something like 85% of the federal workforce is not in the DC area.
That's right. That's correct.
Yeah, they're out there in these office buildings. And so if they're mandated to either quit or come to work, they're going to come to work.
I think that generally
until they get fired by Vivek.
But I think that probably is right. I don't know for sure, but I think you're right about that.
Not positive either, but I think that's right.
Guys, I'm hearing stories about major companies. Everybody seems to be watching Amazon and whether Amazon's going to be able to get their employees to come back. And I'm hearing stories about people who have been working remotely who are being told to come back, and they don't want to come back. And a lot of them are going to quit if they have to.
Let them quit.
Let them quit.
I'm with you.
Gary, here's what's happening. Our fertility rate, birth rate, Bob knows this better than I do. What is it, Bob? Now, replacement rate is less than 2 for 2, right? It's 1.7 to 2.
Yeah. Yep.
And then you look on the other side at AI and a more productive person, but fewer people being more productive. If you don't have fewer people at age 18 coming into the workforce, being equally or better productive than that cohort was before, our standard of living declines. There's no substitute. The revenue for government isn't produced by no jobs or the decline in the productivity from those jobs. So I don't know the answer. I'm not an economist, and I don't know if economists have the answer. No offense intended, my dear friend.
No, you don't get answers just because you're an economist.
But how do you answer? That's a conundrum. How do you solve that fiscal budgeting problem if a president is saying, I've got a couple of guys that are going to tell you, Mr. and Mrs. Congressperson, we're going to cut $2 trillion out of your spending.
Well, first off,
The assumption is, and my assumption is, so much of that is waste that it should be cut out.
Well,
Those people, many, I don't know how many federal employees there are who have second jobs while they're doing their job. But I don't think it's a
over
small
half,
number.
over half.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me one bit. But basically, there's a lot of waste in the federal government, a tremendous amount of waste, in any government and any large organization, but especially
You
in
know,
government, because
that is true, almost certainly true. And however, that money that is spent is somebody's income.
Exactly. So
Which in
what's the
turn gets
offset?
spent.
If that
And
happens,
so if that isn't there, there has to be a significant decline in spending,
exactly.
I'm sorry, a significant decline in what?
in consumption
Spending.
spending.
Well, the one example we have, and I mentioned it before, was back in the 1920s. When again, the government at the time, they cut, and this is after the war, so we're not dealing about cutting wartime expenses. We're after the war, we're 1920, the war is over, the defense budget is down. They cut half the budget. And what happened? Those resources immediately, almost immediately, got redirected into productive areas.
Right.
And you know what? The gain in living standards, year over year, averaged 3.5% for the workers in that period of time, when that money was shifted from being wasted to being put back in the economy. So I'm not worried one bit about them cutting $2
I'm not
trillion.
worried. I'm not worried about that over time. I think it would take time to redeploy all those people that got laid off.
Paul, Nebraska is willing to take any new federal agency that wants to be redeployed out of DC to Nebraska.
Yeah, but as
We'll
I said,
take
85% of the personnel's already out of DC.
Yeah, most of them won't come to Nebraska. They'll quit.
okay, so to clarify, the original point that started this was that there is not first off, we're not going to have a world war. It'll be solved because it makes no sense.
Hold it.
I'm so
Oh,
relieved.
No, those are two different things.
Oh, wait.
I
Gary,
don't think there's going to be a world war. I'm not sure this other stuff's going to be solved. I don't think there's going to be a world war.
we totally left out.
Could be that the
Everybody's
Russians and the
forgetting-
Ukrainians just pound each other into nothing.
One second, Hal.
You got South America and you got Africa. Very almost crazy stuff going on in both of those continents.
Right, but who gives a
So
crap?
there won't be a world war, Gary, but that doesn't mean we won't have some of these same kinds of Iranian tensions or Israeli tensions or those kind of, I don't want to call them brush fires, but those tensions. And we've been paying the bill for all that stuff for the last 20 years.
Okay, I agree. I understand what you're saying. I was just trying to summarize a few points so they don't get lost. Number one, we're not going to have a world war as defined as being in a nuclear exchange with China and Russia. I think that is not realistic.
I hope.
That with respect to the government, with respect to a financial crisis from failed mortgages, that's not going to happen either. Just to summarize, because the banks have already written these things down by 50%, because the banks are much more well capitalized than they were in 2008, and the market is adjusting. So we're not going anywhere near there. As far as peace on earth, there's going to be some real challenges. The Chinese have been more aggressive in both Africa and South America. They're going to continue to be that way. There's little challenge to that. But the Chinese are going to get themselves in trouble because they're Chinese, and what they're going to do is they're going to overextend themselves, be overbearing, and they're going to run out of money, and their economy is limited. Plus, we have our economy to be used as a lever, particularly if we get stronger. And further, going along with what Bob was saying, if we have, and what both of you guys were saying, if we cut government jobs and government waste, that will go back into the economy in a more productive fashion, which will be driving everything forward. But one question, Bob, going back to the roaring 20s, we're roaring. But then we had 1929 and the stock market crash.
Yeah, all
How
it
is
takes,
today
all it
different?
takes, Mary, Gary,
Gary.
is a major, Gary, whatever your name is. All it takes is a major,
Oh, yeah, who's that?
all it
Right.
takes is a major shift in policy, and that's what we had in 1929. We have massive increase in tariffs overnight. As a matter of fact, as that bill moved through Congress in 1929 is when the stock market actually crashed.
Okay, so Bob,
Smooth
so
Hawley
Bob,
tariffs?
so Bob, that's
The
a
smooth
pretty
Hawley tariff.
important
It was
point.
passed the next year, but the
Is
market looks ahead.
What's your view on tariffs, Bob?
I think you have to be very careful with making major changes such as tariffs in areas that you don't know anything about. Because the system is so complex that no one truly understands it all. And you're more likely to do damage with major tariff changes unless they're mostly directed at someone who has the inclination to wipe you out, like China. I mean, China has basically made it clear they want to control the world.
I fully support
They're
the
an enemy,
aggressive
and they're an
use of
enemy.
tariffs
I can see
to
tariffs
counter.
against China. I can
What-
see large tariffs.
Bob,
We've already
Paul,
started.
Paul, what's your response to that, Paul?
I fully support the aggressive use of tariffs to counter aggressive mercantilist policies, such as those that have been implemented by China. It's more than that, because their entire economic and industrial strategy focuses on exports, subsidize exports directly and through the state banks. This isn't a level playing field. It has never been a level playing field, and it's time we hit them right in the mouth. I'm
Well-
not a big fan of tariffs in general, but I think that selective use of tariffs to offset abuses of the trading system are entirely appropriate.
And I'd like to see, and I agree with both Bob and Paul, Gary, I'd like to see us think in these terms, and it really ticks me off to listen to the mainstream media on this tariff kick right now going on in the news. The use of a tariff is a simple tool. It says, if I make widgets in Milwaukee and China makes widgets and they subsidize them into my market, I'm okay with your widgets being sold here, but not because your quality is better, because your subsidy makes them cheaper.
Right.
So on the basis of quality, if my Milwaukee widget is higher quality than the Chinese subsidized widget, put a tariff on them. That levels the workforce productivity
Right,
playing field globally.
But
That's the issue. And I would like our politicians
we have
start talking about
we have
meritocracy
existing
and quality,
legislation.
and that's the advantage that
Okay,
tariffs
guys,
has selected.
Can I point something out?
But we have existing compensatory duty legislation to do
Absolutely.
exactly that.
Absolutely,
Guys.
Paul. And
Right.
everybody's forgetting that. We have that. It's in the regime.
Yeah, it's
Boys,
part of our
can I
regime.
point something out regarding tariffs? The guy who's talking about it is Donald Trump, who is a businessman, and he negotiates from the moment he says hello. And the media, when they make a big deal about tariffs, interestingly enough, as much as they hate him, they're helping him because they're giving more bargaining chips. The fact is, I think that there'll be a lot of talk about tariffs. He will threaten the tariffs. And I think for the most part, we're not going to see much in tariffs. I think, in fact, what we will see is lower tariffs and greater trade,
Maybe.
providing it's fair trade.
Yeah, but if that were the
Beware
case-
of the Senate.
If that were the case, I'd rather see him open the scenario by offering to reduce our duties if they'll reduce their duties,
And you know what?
instead of leading with an
Paul,
increase in
Paul,
tax.
you'll remember, right now, the big issue would be the simple look at the most favored nations treatment for China.
Absolutely, you got that.
If he just zeroed in on that instead of higher tariffs, he'd paralyze them.
I 100% agree with that.
Just for those who are not aware, within the next 2 days, we are coming out with 120 forecasts, economic and otherwise, for 2025 and 2026. We are identifying the dates that we think we made the forecasts and the dates that we think these things will happen so people can keep a scorecard, which we think will be even better than the odds that the betting odds were that Trump was going to be elected to office. We'll keep in touch so people can see that. But the bottom line of it is there's optimism that people seem to be having. And this is a good thing. The country needs it. I think that,
Gary, I have a good friend in the deep state that just put his house up for sale today
okay, why?
because he wants the hell out of there because he knows what's coming.
So in other words, he lives in Washington, D.C.
I just tell you, that's right.
Okay, that's fine. We know that. That's the way it is. And the deep state, they should be running for cover because I think that it's going to be significantly reduced. But I don't think they're going away because I think for some of these people, it's a matter of survival on multiple levels.
I'd like you to all cast your eyes on Vice President Vance over the next 6 months. Pay close attention to what he does, where he's working, and how he's building his network for 2030.
I think that's a very interesting point because he's gone dark since the election.
Yep. Interesting. Very interesting.
As I understand it, he's working in the background to make sure
Don't know what he's doing, but he's
to make sure that the confirmations are lined up and get approved.
Well, but I actually have to give the Biden / who was a Obama or Biden culture in DC over time some credit. In the regulatory process, in my view, in my opinion, what I've seen, I don't know at all, they've worked very hard to build in insulation to changing their work when the administration changes. So I think Trump's people have got their work cut out for them because a lot of the work they've done on
because what I read is that the Biden administration is doing a lot of that now.
Yeah, they've done, but before now, Paul, the last 3 or 4 months, they've seen the handwriting on the wall.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
it's going to be an interesting fight the next 12 months on the regulatory front.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the regulatory areas are some of the key areas for reducing costs.
Now, can they kill Gavin Newsom in California?
That would be good. Yeah,
that's the key.
Okay, just to wrap things up really fast, Hal Daub, regarding a Trump administration, is it going to be a good, positive administration for the country? Yes or no?
Yes.
Bob Janetsky.
Another win for Trump.
Paul McGonigal.
I'm hopeful.
Okay, and we all believe that the country will prosper, and that he will leave office as appropriate.
All I can say, the early signs are at this point in the first Trump administration, they were just flailing around. It was chaos.
And what good way to describe it, Paul. I agree.
They've come out of the box in a way different way this time than they did the first time.
Hey,
and that got my attention immediately.
You know, my friends, who the winner is? Melania.
No kidding.
She's the winner.
Yeah, she ought to stop gloating, though, don't you think?
Okay, on that note, I'd like to say thank you to everybody. As you know, have a good week. We will meet again soon. And very simply, God bless America. America has indeed been blessed.
Happy Thanksgiving, guys.
Have a good Thanksgiving. Be well.
Before the holidays, the best to you guys all for the holidays.
Be well.
Thanks, Gary.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Bye-bye.